In this lesson, we'll continue our discussion of the respiratory system by taking a look at some of the lower structures. We'll take a look at the trachea, commonly known as the windpipe, the two lungs, and then all the tubes in the lung known as the bronchial tree. So let's start with the trachea or the windpipe. Now, this begins at a cartilage in the lower part of the larynx known as the cricoid cartilage, and then it projects down into the mediastinum. Once it ends in the mediastinum, it's going to split into two tubes that we call the right and left primary bronchi. So if you recognize here, this would be the larynx. At this lower cartilage right there is the cricoid cartilage. The trachea extends down from there and it goes into the mediastinum, and then when it ends, this is going to be the left primary bronchus. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then here's the right primary bronchus over here. Okay, so the trachea is in the mediastinum, and then the heart would be right below it right there. Now, our trachea is made up of these hyaline cartilage rings, which we're going to call tracheal cartilages. You could also call them tracheal rings. Since they're made up of hyaline cartilage, their job is to keep the trachea supported, right? They're going to strengthen and protect the airway. We would not want the trachea to collapse, right? We wouldn't survive if we had a collapsed trachea. So these cartilages are going to help to keep the trachea open. Let's take a look at one. So here's a cross section where in the front here, this big tube, everything inside my pointer is the trachea, and then the tube behind it is the esophagus, right? So the trachea sits in front of the esophagus. How do we always know the esophagus? When you look at the lumen here, it's always going to be like collapsed. Where the trachea, look at this, the lumen is open. So why is that? This blue structure here is the tracheal cartilage, this whole thing right here. This is supporting the lumen, it's keeping it open. But notice it's not a complete ring, it's more like a horseshoe. But the trachea is closed in the back by some soft tissue here. This red material, this is going to be a muscle called the trachealis muscle, right here. And then this yellow substance right here, or yellow fibers, this is the annular ligament. The annular ligament. This is actually elastic fibers. So what closes up again the back of the trachea is again all this soft tissue here, trachealis muscle, and then annular ligament right there. So what's the benefit of that is this: when we swallow, the esophagus can expand a bit into the back soft part of the trachea. Okay, let's go back, make sure we get everything here. All right, so the tracheal cartilages or the tracheal rings, there's anywhere from 15 to 20 of them. Again, their job is to strengthen and protect. And like I said before, they are not a complete circle. They're more like a horseshoe. And what closes them up in the back is going to be the trachealis muscle right here, and then the elastic ligament known as the annular ligament. Okay, so when the trachea comes down into the mediastinum and it ends, that area where it ends is known as the carina. So here's another picture we could see here. This is the larynx. Here's the cricoid cartilage right there. You see that nicely this time, and then the trachea going down into the mediastinum, and then right here where it splits, where it's going to stop, this is known as the carina. The carina is actually an internal ridge that we don't see, so we just kind of use this as a reference point. And then we can see here, this is going to be the left primary bronchus, and then the right primary bronchus. Again, we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, let's take a look at, now that we know the structure of the trachea, let's take a look at the histology. So the trachea is lined by a couple layers of histological tissue. The innermost lining is known as the mucosa. So we know that a mucosa always has a layer of epithelial cells and then right underneath it some areolar connective tissue called the lamina propria. So the epithelial cells that make up the mucosa are ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Interspersed within these pseudostratified columnar cells are going to be goblet cells, and we know that the goblet cells, their function is to produce mucus for us. Right? They're going to produce mucus. Right? So we have the layer of epithelial cells, and then always underneath it is going to be the lamina propria. Now, the trachea then has underneath the mucosa a layer known as the submucosa. And one of the things that's important about this, the submucosa has a lot of large mucus glands, and these mucus glands are going to produce mucus in this layer, and then there's going to be ducts that bring the mucus onto the surface of the pseudostratified cells. And the function of the mucus, whether they're produced by the goblet cell or by the mucus glands in the submucosa, is the mucus is going to keep, first of all, the respiratory membrane moist, right? We don't want it to dry out and cause cracking. And it's also going to act as the mucus is going to act to trap any debris. If anything did get down into the trachea, it would stick to the mucus, and then the mucus is continually brought up. That when we bring the mucus up all the time, it's known as the mucus escalator. Right? We're kind of continually bringing the mucus up. All right, then just outside that would be the hyaline cartilage, and then a lining around the hyaline cartilage known as the perichondrium. So let me take you back to this picture here for a moment. So you can see this purple here would be like the pseudostratified columnar cells. The yellow would be the lamina propria. This kind of purplish pinkish area here, this is the submucosa. And then look, big gland right here, and then there's a duct that brings the mucus out onto the surface here. And then here's the hyaline cartilage. Okay, so pseudostratified columnar epithelium, right here is the lamina propria, here is the submucosa, here's the hyaline cartilage. Here's, again, another picture similar to the one that I just showed you. Again, you can see the trachea anterior, nice open lumen. This red this time is going to be the hyaline cartilage, right? That's the cartilaginous ring of the tracheal cartilage. Remember, it doesn't close up in the back, it ends about there. Here's the soft tissue in the middle, so that would be the trachealis muscle and the annular ligament. And then, again, the collapsed lumen of the esophagus, right? That's a classic appearance. This is what it would look like under the microscope. So now we're like at high power, right? High power is over 400 times. So just to give you an idea, this is what the pseudostratified columnar cells would look like. All of these here. And then right above my pointer, those little fibers going up, that's the cilia. Then underneath the epithelial cells, all this here, lamina propria, that's the areolar connective tissue. Then this whole layer here, everything here where my pointer is the submucosa, and that's the one that's going to contain large glands, like right here. See this circle? That's a gland. Here's another one, gland. Right up here, gland. And then these glands have ducts that go up and bring the mucus to line the the mucosa there. And then here we see the next layer out would be the hyaline cartilage, right? So if you remember from when you studied tissues in Anatomy 1, this is classic hyaline cartilage. Another picture. I love this picture here too. Watch this. You see the hair-like cilia, pseudostratified columnar cells, right? Underneath it, lamina propria. Then this layer here would be the submucosa, all of this submucosa. Look at this beautiful round gland. Glands are usually round like that. That's a nice gland that's going to make mucus for us. And then this is just a blow up again of the hyaline cartilage. Okay, so that's what we need to know for the trachea. Let's take a look at both of the lungs. So we have a left lung and a right lung. Each lung sits in a cavity known as the pleural cavity. So that means we have a left pleural cavity with the left lung, right pleural cavity with the right lung. The lung itself and the cavity itself have a lining. It's a serous membrane that helps to produce a thin, slippery fluid that reduces friction as the lungs expand and contract. The name of that lining is the pleura, right? So this is a serous membrane. We call it the pleura. Now, the lining that is on the lung itself is known as the visceral pleura. Visceral means organ, so that's a visceral pleura would be on the organ, in this case would be the lung. The parietal pleura is the lining that's on the cavity wall. It would be like lining where the ribs and the muscles are that make up our frame. And again, the function of the serous membrane is always to reduce friction. So here's a good picture. They're showing you an anterior view. This would be the left pleural cavity with the left lung in it, right pleural cavity with the right lung. Then they took a section of the lung and the body wall and then they blew it up over here. So what we're seeing here, this is the left lung in this case. Now, the white line on the left lung represents the visceral pleura. That's the serous membrane on the lung. Over here, this is a rib that's been cut. Here's the rib below it that's cut, and then here's the muscle between the ribs, right? This would be the intercostal muscles. And then out here, this is the skin. This would be like the dermis and the epidermis, let's say. And so that would be the skin right there. So this white line here now, that's up against the body wall cavity, right? The pleural cavity. This is going to be called the parietal pleura. Right? They're both the same. Under the microscope, they would look the same. They both produce, the serous fluid. Now, the space between the visceral and the parietal pleura is known as the pleural cavity. This, though, is not empty. It's filled with that serous fluid. And again, the function of that serous fluid is going to be to reduce the friction. Again, our lungs are constantly moving, they're expanding and contracting, right? That would produce friction. And friction in the body is never good. So let's actually look now at the structure of the lung, right? We'll look at the anatomy of the lung. So the area in either the right or the left lung where structures come into the lung or exit the lung is going to be called the hilum, right? That's where pulmonary nerves, pulmonary blood vessels. If you remember when you studied the heart, the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein, even lymph vessels are going to enter and leave the lung. Let's take a look. So here's a picture of the right lung where we're looking at the medial side, there at the medial surface. This area that's circled in black here, everything in here is the hilum, right? So this would be like the pulmonary artery. Here's your pulmonary veins. This represents some of the bronchi, the tubes that are bringing in air, but they're all within this area here. Same thing on the left, right? So that whole circle right there, everything in the middle would be the hilum. Now, our lungs are like a triangle. The bottom is going to be broad, and the bottom is referred to as the base, and it sits right on our diaphragm muscle. And the top is going to be more pointy, so they call that the apex. That extends way up, a little bit above the first rib, just under the clavicle. Let's take a look. So here's an actual dissection. I like this picture because you can see the base here and see how it sits right on the diaphragm right there. It's right above the diaphragm. This muscle is the diaphragm. Let's go to this one here. So this would be the base of the right lung here, and then the point is the apex. Right? Left lung would be the same thing, apex, and then the base down over here. Okay, so make sure we got everything, right? So the hilum, entrance and exit point, the base is the bottom of the lung, it's going to be broad, and then the apex is the top of the lung, it's going to be pointy. Now, the right and left lungs are not symmetrical, they're not identical. There's actually structural differences. So we're going to see that each lung has lobes. These lobes are formed by these deep grooves that we call fissures. That's an important word to know. It's a deep groove. So The right lung, it turns out, and when you do it on dissection, you'll see that it has three lobes, and the left lung only has two lobes. That means the number of fissures is going to be variable. Let's take a look. Here's the right lung. So the oblique fissure you're going to see is common to both lungs. You're going to see that in both lungs. So each lung is going to have an oblique fissure. If we just had an oblique fissure here, that means there would be a lobe on the left and a lobe on the right. We would have two lobes. But the right lung has an additional fissure that cuts across this way. This is called the horizontal fissure. So that gives the right lung three lobes: a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. Okay, so the fissures I'd like you to know are the oblique fissure, a horizontal fissure right there. How about the left lung? The left lung, if you notice, also has an oblique fissure, so that we have one, two lobes. But notice there's no horizontal fissure. Right, so that's why it's different. So that would just be the oblique fissure. Now you're going to call this lobe the superior lobe, and this one the inferior lobe. Okay, let's go back to the notes. All right, so the right lung has three lobes: superior, middle, inferior, and it has the two fissures, the oblique fissure, and then this one has the horizontal. The left lung only has the two lobes because it only has an oblique fissure. Right, so look at this: oblique fissure in the right lung, oblique fissure in the left lung. Now the left lung only has a superior and an inferior lobe. A couple other differences between the right and left. The right lung is going to be a little bit wider, and it's a little bit displaced higher because of the liver below the diaphragm. And then the left lung is going to be a little bit longer and skinnier, and it's going to be displaced a little bit left because of the heart. And there is something in the left lung to accommodate for the heart known as the cardiac notch. Let's take a look. So here's our left lung. Again, just the kind of base, apex, oblique fissure, superior lobe, inferior lobe, right? That's what we know so far. Now the heart would be sitting over here where my cursor is going, my pointer is going. So the apex of the heart pushes towards the left, and it causes the formation here of the left lung. This little notch right here is called the cardiac notch to accommodate for the heart. We don't see that on the right lung, right? You don't see that on the right lung. You only see it on the left lung. Okay, so that cardiac notch is something that helps you to identify the left lung. Okay, so now that we know the anatomy of the lungs, let's take a look at all the tubes inside the lung. This is what we would refer to as the bronchial tree. The bronchial tree. This extends from the primary bronchi all the way down to the air sacs known as the alveoli. I'll review this again, but I had mentioned the primary bronchi at the very beginning of this lesson. When that trachea ends, the two tubes that it becomes are going to be the primary bronchi. So that's basically the starting point of this bronchial tree all the way down into the air sacs. So what makes something a bronchi and then eventually a bronchiole is this: bronchi are always going to have cartilage on them, right? So watch this sentence here. The walls of the primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi, I'm going to define those for you in a minute, but notice they're all called bronchi: primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi. As they get smaller and smaller, these tubes, they're going to contain progressively less and less cartilage. And then as they get smaller and smaller, there's going to be more and more smooth muscle. That smooth muscle in the smaller tubes is very important to us because that regulates the diameter of the tube. There's something known as bronchodilation, right? If we need more air in our lungs, the tubes can get wider. allowing for more airflow. If we need less airflow, the tubes can become more narrow. That's bronchoconstriction. Right? So bronchi are going to always have cartilage on them, but as the bronchi get smaller and smaller, there's going to be less and less cartilage. So I want to show you real quick. This is an overview. We're going to get into this in more detail in a moment. I just want to show you the progression of these tubes and show you the cartilage that I'm talking about. So see if you can follow me on this. Remember, this was the trachea. Then the dividing point right here is the carina. Then the trachea splits into a left and right primary bronchus. You don't have to know this yet. Right? We don't have to know those names yet. This picture here is just, by the way, only showing the bronchial tree on the left side. The same thing is happening over here. It just would be too confusing if we had all the tubes and labeling. So we're just showing it on the left side. So this is what we're going to see is the primary bronchi. Then the primary bronchi are going to split into secondary bronchi. All of this blue, these blue plates are hyaline cartilage, right? So since they have hyaline cartilage, we call them bronchi. Then they're going to divide into these tubes. These are known as tertiary bronchi. We still call these bronchi because the tubes have hyaline cartilage on it. Then the bronchi are going to get smaller and smaller, but we still call them bronchi because, again, of these cartilaginous plates. But notice as we get smaller and smaller tubes, the cartilage diminishes. We don't have as much. At some point, like right here, there's no more cartilage. We now change the name of these tubes from bronchi to bronchioles. Okay, and then we're going to look at the different types of bronchioles in a minute, and then here's going to be the air sacs. So what distinguishes, again, something that's a bronchi or bronchus is the fact that all of these have cartilage. Once it loses its cartilage, we call it bronchioles. Right, this is all going to be the smooth muscle that makes up the wall. Okay, so again, just make sure we have everything. The bronchial structure, again, as the bronchi get smaller and smaller, there's going to be less and less cartilage and more smooth muscle. Why is that important? It's because the smooth muscle will allow for control of airflow, right? We can have bronchodilation, we can have bronchoconstriction. Okay, this is just a cross section of a bronchus. So how do we know it's a bronchus? See the pink, this is cartilage out here. So this would show a cartilaginous plate. Right, a little bit out over here too. This just happens to be an artery next door. So now that we kind of have a general idea of the structure of the bronchi, let's take a look at the different types. Let's name them. So again, once the trachea ends and it splits, it's going to form what we call the primary bronchi. There's going to be one bringing air to the left lung, and then the other one is going to bring air into the right lung. Some of the newer textbooks now are even calling the primary bronchi the main bronchi. So that's something that you may hear. So each primary bronchus, I should say, is going to enter each lung. Let's see if we have a picture real quick. I'm going to show you back to this one here, way back when. Watch this. So this was the carina, right? So this is going to be the left primary bronchus, right primary bronchus. Okay. Just a couple differences between the two bronchi. The right primary bronchus is going to be larger in diameter, and it's going to descend at a steeper angle. For those of you going into clinical medicine, that's kind of an important difference between the left and the right. When somebody aspirates something, and it goes down, into the lung, it's usually going to go into the right primary bronchus because it's larger in diameter and it runs at a steeper angle. So an aspiration is going to be more on the right side. Not that it doesn't happen on the left, but just anatomically, it allows for someone to aspirate and more onto the right side. Okay, so the primary bronchus is going to be a left and a right. That's the main bronchus bringing air to each lung. Now the primary bronchi, they're going to divide into secondary bronchi. These you can call lobar bronchi. That's because each secondary bronchus is going to bring air to a lobe. So we just know from a couple minutes ago the right lung had 3 lobes. That means the right lung is going to have 3 secondary bronchi, while the left lung has 2 lobes. That means it's going to have 2 secondary bronchi. All right, so those are known as lobar bronchi. Now, each secondary or lobar bronchus is going to divide to form what we call tertiary bronchi. These are sometimes called segmental bronchi. The reason for that is the tertiary bronchi are going to bring air to a single bronchopulmonary segment. Basically, guys, these are just subdivisions within each lobe, right? So the tertiary bronchi are bringing air to each bronchopulmonary segment. And you can see here, it's not symmetrical. The right lung has 10 of these segments, where the left lung has 8 or 9. Okay, and then eventually those tertiary bronchi are going to break down into multiple bronchioles, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if I go back to this picture here, just on the left side, here's the left primary bronchus, then secondary bronchus here, secondary bronchus here. Since this is the left side, we only have one secondary bronchus and a second secondary bronchus. Then the secondary bronchi are going to break up into the tertiary bronchi. That's all these, right? These are known as the segmental branches. So as I mentioned before, at some point, as the bronchi get smaller and smaller, they lose their cartilaginous plates. And at that point, we're going to change the name to bronchioles, right? So the bronchioles, again, the main thing, highlight right here, have no cartilage. Their wall is made up of smooth muscle. Again, I'm going to keep going back to this picture, right? So here at this point, this is going to be the bronchioles. These walls are all made up of smooth muscle. Now, there's 2 different types of bronchioles. The small branches that are leading air towards an air sac are known as terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are just kind of leading air to an air sac. Look at this stat right here. One tertiary bronchus that we had mentioned before, right, the segmental bronchus, ultimately will form about 6,500 terminal bronchioles. Okay, so if you take a look here, this would be like the bronchioles. Actually, I blew this up a little bit. Here's the bronchioles here, and then these little branches coming off of here, these are going to lead towards the air sacs. These are the terminal bronchioles. Then they're going to give rise to the next bronchiole, known as the respiratory bronchiole. What makes something the respiratory bronchiole is this. That's this tube going down here, but the tube itself has air sacs on it. It has an alveoli. That means gas exchange can now happen in this tube, and that's how it's differentiated as a respiratory bronchiole from a terminal bronchiole. Notice the terminal bronchiole does not have air sacs. Right? So once the terminal bronchiole starts to develop air sacs, we call it the respiratory bronchiole, and that's now going to lead to this alveolar sac over here, which we're going to talk about next. So let's go back to the notes. All right, so there's 2 types of bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles, right? These are just bringing air into the air sacs, and then once the terminal bronchioles start to develop alveoli on them, they're going to be called respiratory bronchioles, right? So they contain alveoli, which now allow for the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. From the respiratory bronchioles, we're now going to lead to something known as an alveolar duct, which brings air into the alveolar sac. What does that mean? So this whole cluster of alveoli is going to be fed by a duct. We don't see it in here. I'll show you a picture in a minute. By a duct known as the alveolar duct that's bringing air into this sac right over here that has alveoli. So each cluster here, kind of like a group of grapes, this is going to be one alveolar sac. Here's another alveolar sac. Here's another alveolar sac. And inside there's a tube known as a duct. That's known as the alveolar duct. That's going to feed the alveolar sac. And then each individual air sac is known as an alveoli. And I'll go over their anatomy in a second. Let's take now this alveolar sac and blow it up. Watch this. So here is a whole, well, I'll do it over here since we have it labeled here. This would be a cluster as an alveolar sac. Here would be another cluster. This would be another alveolar sac. Here's another cluster as an alveolar sac. So what we see here, guys, here's a bronchiole. It's probably a terminal bronchiole. Notice there's no cartilage on it. It only has smooth muscle. So that's how I know it's a bronchiole. Right, so this is probably a terminal bronchiole. But watch this. Now a tube comes off of it right here. That's a bronchiole also. But notice this thing that kind of looks like a ping pong ball. That's an alveolus. That's on the tube. So since there's an alveolus on the tube, that means gas exchange can take place. That makes this tube a respiratory bronchiole. Then that's leading air into this tube here. We couldn't see this before on the other picture, but now since it's cut open, this is going to be called the alveolar duct. And that's bringing air into this air sac over here. This is going to be called the alveolar sac. And then each one of these bubbles here is an individual alveolus, right? It's an individual alveolus. Okay, so the alveolar duct is going to feed the alveolar sac. Okay, let me go back to that note in a minute. The last thing I want to show you is this. This is an actual diagram showing you an alveolus made up of different cells. So the cells that make up the wall of the air sac or the alveolus is known as the type 1 alveolar cells. Right? They used to be called type 1 pneumocytes, but now they call them type 1 alveolar cells. They make up the actual structure of the air sac. Then interspersed, these cells, like right over here, these cells are going to make a chemical known as surfactant. And the surfactant is basically a oily type of substance that prevents when the alveoli collapse, when we breathe out, it prevents the wall of the air sac to stick to one another, right? Prevents the wall from sticking from one another. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to reinflate the lungs. So these are known as the type 2 alveolar cells, right? These used to be called type 2 pneumocytes. And again, I want you to know they produce this chemical called surfactant that prevents the alveoli from collapsing. Right, just one other couple quick things here. You'll also see around the alveoli, these bands right here are actually elastic fibers that allow the alveoli to expand, but then when we breathe out, to recoil back. And then here they're showing you, in addition to the elastic fibers, the capillaries that are around the alveoli for gas exchange. Okay, so that would be the last slide here. Yeah, we got that. The last slide I want to show you, this is what it would look like under the microscope if we just put a piece of lung under the microscope and look at this. You're really on, kind of scanning power, low power. You would see all these are going to be the alveoli. Right, made up of simple squamous epithelium, right? The type 1 alveolar cells. Here you happen to see a little bit of the alveolar duct. You may not see that on your microscope, but you would definitely see all the alveoli. All right, so that concludes this lesson on the trachea, the two lungs, and then the anatomy of the bronchial tree.